Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into something deeply familiar and yet strangely mysterious, your own mind. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a quiet joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into the mind together. And if your thoughts begin to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let them drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Take a moment if you like, and simply notice where you are right now. The faint sounds around you, the weight of your body resting, the quiet rhythm of your breath moving in and out. Everything feels stable, familiar, real. But there is something quietly unsettling about that word, real. Because there have been other moments, not so long ago, where everything also felt completely real. Perhaps you were walking through a place that made perfect sense at the time. Maybe you were speaking with someone you knew or doing something ordinary, and yet, when you woke up, it all slipped away. You realised that none of it had existed in the way you thought it did. It was a dream. And what's curious is not just that dreams feel real, but that while you're inside them, you almost never question them. The impossible becomes ordinary. A room may change shape. A conversation may jump from one place to another. Words on a page might blur or rearrange themselves in ways that would seem strange if you were awake. And yet, in the moment, it all feels completely natural. It's only afterward, when you wake, that something shifts. The illusion dissolves, and you see it for what it was. But here is a gentle question to hold. Like a small object in your hands. If your mind can create a world that feels entirely real, without any input from your eyes, your ears, or the outside world, then what is it exactly that makes this moment different? You might instinctively say, well, this feels more stable, more consistent, more grounded. And that's true in a way. The world you're in right now follows certain patterns. Objects stay where you expect them to be. Time seems to move forward in a steady rhythm. The details hold together. But even in this waking world, there are small clues that something more subtle is happening. For example, if you look at a sentence, perhaps even the one you're hearing right now, your mind doesn't read every letter one by one. Instead, it quickly predicts what should be there, filling in gaps so smoothly that you rarely notice. Sometimes, if a word is slightly misspelled, you still understand it without effort. Your brain quietly corrects it for you. Or consider how easily you recognize a familiar face, even from a distance or in dim light. Your mind doesn't wait for perfect information. It makes a quick guess, assembling a complete image from fragments. In a sense, your experience of reality is not something you passively receive. It's something your mind is actively building, moment by moment. And perhaps the most curious part is that you're rarely aware of this construction. It feels immediate, direct, as though you are simply looking out at the world as it is. But what if that feeling is part of the construction itself? There's a simple experiment you may have tried before, even without realizing it. If you hold out your hand and press your fingers gently against your palm, you feel resistance, a clear boundary between your fingers and your skin. It confirms something basic, that your body is solid, that the world follows consistent rules. But in a dream, that same action might behave differently. Your fingers might pass through your hand as if it weren't there at all, and in that moment, if you notice it, something remarkable can happen. You might realize You are dreaming. People sometimes practice this kind of reality checking during the day. They pause, even in ordinary moments, and ask themselves quietly, "Am I awake?" They look for small inconsistencies, not because they expect to find them, but because they understand something deeper, that the mind can, under the right conditions, create a complete and convincing reality. And this leads to a thought that doesn't demand an answer, only a moment of reflection. If the difference between dreaming and waking is not simply whether something feels real, then how do we truly know where we are? It's not a question meant to unsettle you, but rather to soften the edges of certainty. Because when we begin to see that our experience is shaped, filtered, interpreted, gently assembled by the mind, it opens up a quieter kind of understanding. That what we perceive is not the world in its raw form, but a version of it, one that is useful, meaningful, and coherent enough for us to move through. Like a map. Not the territory itself, but something that helps us navigate. And just like a map, it simplifies. It leaves things out. It highlights what matters most for the moment. So as you rest here, listening, you might begin to notice that your sense of reality is not something fixed and unchanging. It's something gently held in place, moment by moment, by a mind that is always working just beneath the surface, quietly predicting, quietly organizing, quietly telling a story that feels like the world. And as that idea begins to settle softly, almost like a ripple fading across still water, it invites us to look a little closer at how this process begins, at how the mind takes fragments of sensation and shapes them into something we call reality, and that is where our journey will gently continue. As that quiet question lingers in the background, there is something gentle we can begin to notice, something so familiar that it often goes completely unseen. The world you experience right now feels whole, complete, solid. It stretches out around you with colours, shapes, sounds, and textures that seem immediate and undeniable. It feels as though you're simply opening your eyes and receiving what is already there. But in truth, what you experience is not the world itself. It is something softer, something filtered. Imagine for a moment that you're standing in front of a vast landscape, a quiet field at dusk perhaps, with fading light brushing against the edges of distant trees. You take it in as a single, seamless scene, but what you're actually receiving is far less complete than it feels. Your eyes only capture a narrow range of light, a thin slice of what exists. There are colours beyond what you can see, frequencies that pass quietly through your surroundings without ever being noticed. Your ears, too, only hear a small portion of the sounds that fill the air. There are vibrations all around you, high, low, subtle, that never reach your awareness. And yet, none of this feels incomplete. Your mind fills in the silence. It paints over the gaps so smoothly that you rarely suspect anything is missing. There's a small, almost hidden example of this happening right now, even as you listen. Each of your eyes has a tiny blind spot, a place where no visual information is detected at all. If you were to look directly at it, you wouldn't see a dark hole or an empty patch. Instead, your mind quietly replaces it with whatever it expects to be there. The pattern continues, the colours blend, the world remains whole. You never notice the absence because your mind has already decided what should take its place. In a way, your experience of reality is not built from perfect information, but from a combination of fragments and expectations. It's a bit like listening to a familiar melody played softly in another room. You don't need to hear every note to recognize the song. Your mind fills in what's missing, completing the pattern with ease. And this process extends far beyond simple perception. When you read a sentence, you rarely pause to examine each individual letter. Your mind anticipates the meaning before the words are fully processed. Even if something is slightly out of place, you glide past it without hesitation. When you walk into a familiar room, you don't need to scan every detail to know where things are. You already have a sense of the space, a quiet internal map that guides your awareness. This is not a flaw in how your mind works. It is a kind of efficiency. The world, in its full complexity, is far too rich, far too detailed for the mind to process every piece of it in real time. So instead, it simplifies. It selects what seems important. It builds a version of reality that is manageable, coherent, and useful. But in doing so, it also creates a subtle distance between what is out there and what you experience. What you see is not the raw world. It is the world interpreted. You might begin to notice this in small ways. Perhaps when you look at something familiar, a cup on a table for instance, you don't really examine it. You recognize it instantly. Your mind labels it, categorizes it, and moves on. But if you slow down, just for a moment, and truly look, you may notice that there is more there than you usually perceive. Slight variations in colour, tiny imperfections, the way light rests unevenly across its surface. These details were always present. They simply weren't necessary for your mind to include in its usual version of reality. And so, they were gently set aside. In this way, your experience is shaped not only by what is present, but by what is omitted. There is another quiet example that unfolds when you move through space. As you turn your head, your eyes shift rapidly from one point to another. These movements are quick, almost invisible to you, but during each tiny shift your visual input briefly fades. The world, for a fraction of a moment, is not being fully processed, and yet you never experience this as a flicker or a gap. Your mind smooths it over, stitching together a continuous scene. It is as though reality itself flows without interruption, even though, beneath the surface, it is being assembled piece by piece. This gentle construction is happening all the time, not just in what you see, but in how you feel, how you understand, and how you interpret the world around you. Consider how easily two people can experience the same moment in completely different ways. A conversation, a gesture, a passing glance. Each is filtered through layers of memory, expectation, and emotion. What feels meaningful to one person may go unnoticed by another. What feels comforting to one may feel uncertain to someone else. The world in this sense is not a single fixed experience. It is many overlapping interpretations, each one shaped by the mind that perceives it. And perhaps the most interesting part of all this is how invisible the process remains. You do not feel the filtering. You do not notice the construction. You're simply presented with a finished experience, one that feels immediate and complete. It is only when you begin to look more closely, gently, without forcing it, that the edges start to soften. You begin to see that what feels solid is, in some sense, assembled. That what feels direct is, in part, interpreted. And that what feels like reality is also quietly a creation of the mind. This is not something to resist or to question too sharply. It is simply something to notice, like the faint outline of a reflection on water. Because once you begin to see that your experience is shaped in this way, another thought begins to emerge just beneath the surface. If the mind is not simply receiving reality, but actively shaping it, then perhaps it is doing more than just filling in gaps. Perhaps it is, in a quiet and continuous way, anticipating what comes next. And that gentle idea that the mind might be predicting the world before you even perceive it is where our exploration begins to deepen. As you sit with the quiet idea that your experience of the world is gently filtered, another layer begins to reveal itself, not abruptly, but slowly, like a pattern becoming visible in soft light. It may seem natural to assume that your mind works in a simple direction, that the world sends information in and you receive it. Light enters your eyes, sound reaches your ears, sensations move inward and your mind responds. But what if the flow is not only inward? What if, even before the world arrives at your senses, your mind is already reaching outward, forming a quiet expectation of what it is about to encounter? Imagine for a moment that you're listening to someone speak a familiar sentence. Before they finish their thought, you already know how it will end. The final word seems to arrive exactly as expected, almost as if you had heard it before it was spoken. Or think about walking into your home at night. You do not need to carefully inspect every corner to know where things are. You move with a quiet confidence, guided by a sense of what should be there, even before you fully see it. These small everyday moments hint at something deeper. Your mind is not waiting passively for the world to reveal itself. It is quietly preparing for it. In a sense, your brain is constantly making gentle predictions, soft guesses about what is likely to appear next. And when the real sensory information arrives, it is compared against these expectations. If the prediction and the incoming information match closely enough, the experience feels smooth, effortless, almost invisible. You don't notice the process at all. It simply feels like seeing, hearing, knowing. But when there is a mismatch, when something unexpected happens, your attention is drawn instantly. A strange sound in a quiet room, a face you didn't expect to see, a word in a sentence that feels slightly out of place. In those moments, your mind pauses. It adjusts. It updates its understanding. You could think of it like a quiet conversation between expectation and reality. Expectation speaks first, softly suggesting what might be there. Reality responds, confirming or gently correcting. And what you experience is not either one alone, but the blending of both. This might sound abstract at first, but you can begin to feel it in simple ways. Consider how quickly you recognize objects, even when they are partially hidden. A chair behind a table, a face in shadow, a familiar symbol glimpsed only for a moment. You do not build these perceptions from scratch. You complete them. You fill them in. Your mind says quietly, "This is probably a chair," and the rest of the image follows. Or think of those moments when you mishear something. Someone speaks, and you're certain you heard one word, only to realize a moment later that it was something else entirely. For a brief instant, your expectation took the lead, shaping your perception before the actual sound was fully understood. This is not a mistake in the usual sense. It is the natural way your mind works, because the world unfolds quickly, too quickly for your brain to wait for perfect information at every moment. So instead, it moves ahead, predicting, anticipating, preparing. And in most cases, this works beautifully. It allows you to move through life smoothly, without hesitation, to react quickly, to understand efficiently, to feel grounded in a world that appears stable and continuous. But there is a quieter implication here, one that gently echoes back to the question we began with. If your perception of reality is shaped not only by what is there, but by what you expect to be there, then part of what you experience is, in a very real sense, coming from within you. It is not simply given, it is created, moment by moment, through a delicate balance of prediction and correction. You might begin to notice this most clearly in moments of ambiguity, perhaps when you see a shape in the distance and are unsure what it is. For a moment, it could be anything. Your mind offers possibilities, a person, a shadow, an object. And as you move closer, the uncertainty fades, the prediction sharpens, the image settles into something clear. But for that brief moment, reality itself felt flexible, not fixed, but open to interpretation. There are even times when your expectations are so strong that they override what is actually present. Have you ever searched for something, certain that it must be in a particular place, only to overlook it completely, even though it was right in front of you? Your mind had already decided what the scene should look like, and anything that didn't fit that expectation was quietly ignored. It's a curious thought, isn't it? That what you fail to see may not be invisible at all, but simply unexpected. And so, your experience of the world is not just a reflection of what is there, but a collaboration between what is there and what you believe is there. A collaboration that is usually so seamless that it feels like a single, unified reality. But once you begin to notice it, gently, without forcing it, you may find that your sense of certainty softens just a little, not in a way that is unsettling, but in a way that feels more open, more spacious. Because if reality is shaped even in part by your expectations, then it is not something rigid and fixed. It is something alive, something unfolding, and perhaps in a quiet and subtle way, something that your mind is always helping to create. As this idea begins to settle, like a soft echo fading into stillness, it brings us back to something we touched on earlier. A place where the mind does not simply predict reality, but seems to create it entirely, not in small fragments, but in complete, immersive worlds. Worlds where you can walk, speak, feel, and believe, all without question. Worlds that appear, fully formed, the moment you close your eyes and drift into sleep. And in those worlds, the mind is no longer just predicting reality, it is becoming it. As the thought settles that your mind is quietly predicting the world before it fully arrives, there is a place where this process becomes even more vivid, a place where the usual boundaries soften and the mind is left to create more freely. You visit this place every night, and yet it rarely feels unfamiliar. When you fall asleep, something gentle begins to happen. The steady stream of input from the outside world begins to fade. The sounds grow distant. The light behind your closed eyes dims into darkness. The body becomes still, but the mind does not turn off. In fact, in certain stages of sleep, it becomes surprisingly active. You might imagine sleep as a kind of quiet shutdown, a pause in awareness. But if you could gently observe what is happening inside the brain during this time, you would notice something quite different. There are moments when the activity within your mind begins to resemble waking life again. Patterns of energy move across different regions, almost as if the brain is preparing to experience something. And then, without any clear beginning, a world appears. You are somewhere, doing something, speaking to someone, perhaps walking through a place that feels familiar, or drifting through a landscape that could never exist in waking life. And the remarkable part is not just that these scenes appear, but that they feel complete. You do not question the ground beneath your feet. You do not wonder where the light is coming from, or how the scene was constructed. You simply accept it, move within it, and experience it as though it were real. In that moment, your mind is doing something extraordinary. It is creating a world without using your eyes. There is no light entering from the outside, no sound waves travelling through the air into your ears, no physical objects pressing against your skin, and yet you see, you hear, you feel. It is as though your mind has become its own quiet storyteller, generating images, sounds, and sensations from within itself. If you pause and reflect on this gently, it begins to shift something in how we think about perception. Because during the day, it feels as though the world is the source and your mind is the receiver. But in a dream, the roles are reversed. Your mind becomes the source, and what you experience is not received, but generated. You might begin to notice how detailed these inner worlds can be. The texture of a surface beneath your hand, the sound of a voice, familiar or unfamiliar, the movement of space around you as you walk or run or simply stand still. Even time seems to flow in these dreams, sometimes smoothly, sometimes in strange and unexpected ways. And yet, despite all of this complexity, there is no external world guiding it. Only the quiet activity of the mind itself. There is a gentle metaphor that can help bring this into focus. Imagine a small theatre, hidden somewhere deep within your awareness. There is no audience, no external stage, no lights shining in from above, and yet within this space a performance unfolds. Scenes change, characters appear and disappear, stories begin and end, and all of it is created from within the theatre itself. This is what your mind does when you dream. It becomes the stage, the actors, the light, and the story, all at once. There is also something else worth noticing, something subtle but important. Even though these dream worlds can be strange, unpredictable, or even impossible, they still feel coherent while you're inside them. You rarely stop to question whether what you're seeing makes sense. You do not pause to analyze whether the environment follows the rules of physics. You simply move through it, accepting it as your current reality. This tells us something very quiet, but very profound. The feeling of reality does not come from accuracy, it comes from consistency. As long as the experience flows smoothly enough, as long as your mind can maintain the illusion, it feels real. This is why a dream can feel just as vivid as waking life, even though it is entirely generated. And this is also why, when you wake up, the difference becomes clear almost instantly. The dream dissolves, and your waking world takes its place, bringing with it a stronger sense of stability. But if we return to the question gently, without forcing it, something begins to shift again. If your mind can create a fully immersive world during sleep, one that you experience without question, then how much of your waking world is also shaped in a similar way? Not entirely imagined, of course. There is a world beyond you, something stable and shared, but your experience of it, the colours, the sounds, the meaning, all of that still passes through the same mind, the same system that at night builds entire realities from memory, emotion, and imagination. There is a quiet continuity here. The dreaming mind and the waking mind are not separate things. They are different expressions of the same process, one guided more by external input, the other guided more by internal activity. But both are engaged in the same gentle act of constructing experience. And perhaps that is where the boundary between dreaming and waking becomes less rigid than it first appears. Not a sharp line, but a soft gradient, a shift in how much the outside world shapes what you experience, and how much comes from within. As this idea settles, it opens the door to something even more subtle. Because within dreams there are moments, rare but unmistakable, when something changes. Moments when you're still inside the dream, still surrounded by that internally created world, and yet you begin to realize what is happening. You become aware that you are dreaming, and in that moment, something remarkable begins to unfold. As that quiet image of the dreaming mind lingers, a mind that can create entire worlds without opening your eyes, there is another layer waiting just beneath it. Because even though dreams can feel vivid and complete, they are also, in a subtle way, quite unusual. If you were to step back and observe a dream from the outside, you might notice how easily it bends the rules. A familiar place may suddenly change shape. A person you know might speak in a way that feels slightly off. Time might stretch, skip, or fold into itself. And yet, while you're inside the dream, none of this feels strange. You accept it. You move through it. You believe it. Which leads us to a gentle question. Why? Why does something that would seem impossible during the day feel completely natural at night? The answer is not as complicated as it might first seem. It does not lie in the details of the dream itself, but in how your mind is processing those details. Because when you dream, something very subtle begins to shift. The part of your mind that usually helps you analyze, question, and make sense of the world begins to grow quiet. During waking life, this part works quietly in the background. It helps you recognize when something doesn't fit. It allows you to pause, reflect, and say, "This doesn't seem right." But in a dream, that quiet voice becomes softer. It doesn't disappear completely, but it steps aside, allowing other parts of your mind to take the lead. And one of those parts is deeply connected to how you feel. Emotion. You may have noticed that dreams often feel intensely emotional, even when the story itself makes little sense. A simple interaction might carry a strong feeling of joy, fear, or urgency. A place you've never seen before might feel deeply familiar or strangely unsettling. This emotional tone is what gives the dream its sense of reality. It's not the logic of the situation that convinces you, it's the feeling. You might be walking through a place that couldn't possibly exist. But if it feels right, if it carries a sense of coherence at an emotional level, your mind accepts it. And so, the dream continues. This tells us something very quiet, but very important. The feeling that something is real does not come from careful reasoning. It comes from a sense of emotional consistency. When your emotions align with what you're experiencing, the mind relaxes. It does not question. It does not resist. It simply allows the experience to unfold. You can begin to notice this even in waking life. Think about a moment when you felt certain about something, not because you had carefully analysed it, but because it just felt right. Perhaps a decision you made quickly, a judgment about a person, a reaction to a situation. The feeling came first, the reasoning followed later, if at all. In many ways, your waking experience is not so different from dreaming. Your mind is still interpreting the world, still shaping it, still filtering it through layers of memory and expectation, and your emotions are still playing a central role in how real something feels. This becomes especially clear in moments of fear. If you've ever been alone in a quiet place at night, you might recall how easily your mind begins to imagine possibilities. A small sound becomes something larger. A shadow takes on a shape. The feeling of unease grows even if there's nothing actually there. Your senses have not changed, but your interpretation has, and with it, your experience of reality. It's as though emotion gently adjusts the lens through which you see the world, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to shift how things feel. And in a dream, this process becomes more visible. Without the steady influence of logical analysis, emotion is free to move more fluidly. It shapes the environment, the story, the meaning of what you experience. You might find yourself in a place that feels safe, even if it looks unfamiliar, or in a situation that feels threatening, even if there is no clear reason for it. The emotional tone leads, and the rest follows. There is a softness to this realization, because it suggests that what we call reality is not only about what is objectively present, but about how it is felt. And this feeling is something your mind generates, moment by moment. It is not imposed from the outside. It arises from within. This does not mean that your experience is false or unreliable. It simply means that it is shaped by more than just facts and logic. It is shaped by your inner world, your memories, your expectations, your emotions. And when you begin to see this gently, without forcing it, something shifts. You may find that your sense of certainty becomes a little softer, not weaker, just more open, more aware of the quiet forces that shape how you experience each moment. And perhaps, as you settle into that awareness, there is a kind of calm that comes with it. Because if your mind is always shaping your experience, then it is also capable of shaping how that experience feels. Not in a way that requires effort or control, but in a way that unfolds naturally as you become more aware of it. And as that thought drifts gently into the background, there is another place where this blending of emotion and perception becomes even more vivid. A place where the boundary between dream and waking life becomes thinner, almost transparent. A place where the mind begins to carry fragments of one world into another, and where, for a brief moment, the difference between dreaming and being awake is not so clear at all. As that soft awareness settles, that emotion shapes how real something feels, there's a place where this becomes even more vivid and perhaps a little more surprising, because sometimes the world of dreams does not stay neatly contained within sleep. Sometimes it lingers. Sometimes it follows you, just a little, into waking life. You may have experienced this before, even if only once or twice. A moment when you wake up and something feels not quite right. Your eyes are open. You're aware of the room around you. You can hear the quiet sounds of the night or the early hints of morning. Everything seems familiar, and yet your body does not move. It is as if you are caught between two states, awake, but not fully. There may be a gentle pressure, like a weight resting across your chest. Your breath feels present, but slightly distant, and sometimes there is something more, a shape in the corner of the room, a presence that feels close, even if you cannot clearly see it, a sense that something is there, watching, waiting. And in that moment it feels real, not imagined, not symbolic, but immediate, undeniable. This experience has a quiet name. It is often called sleep paralysis, but rather than thinking of it as something alarming, we can gently understand it as a moment where two worlds overlap. Because during sleep, especially in the deeper stages where dreaming becomes vivid, your body naturally becomes still. This stillness is not a flaw, it is a kind of protection. Your mind may be active, exploring entire worlds, moving freely through imagined spaces, but your body remains calm, quiet, unmoving, so that you do not physically act out those dreams. It is a soft separation between movement and imagination. Usually when you wake, this separation fades almost instantly. Your awareness returns and your body follows. But sometimes, just for a brief moment, awareness returns first. Your mind wakes up, while your body is still resting in that quiet stillness, and in that delicate space between sleep and waking, something interesting happens. The dream has not fully disappeared. Fragments of it remain, not as distant memories, but as present experiences. The mind, still partly in its dreaming mode, continues to generate sensations, images, impressions. But now they are layered over your waking environment. The room is real. Your awareness is real. But the shapes, the sounds, the presence you might feel, those are still being created from within. And because emotion remains active, those sensations can feel deeply convincing. A shadow is not just a shadow. It becomes something more. A sound is not just a sound, it carries meaning. And once again, it is not logic that determines what you experience, but feeling. If there is fear, the mind fills in details that match that feeling. If there is calm, the experience softens more quickly. This is why two people can have similar experiences and describe them in completely different ways. For one, it may feel like something threatening. For another, it may feel like a strange but neutral moment. The difference lies not in the external world, but in how the mind shapes what is perceived. And what makes this so interesting is how close it brings dreaming and waking together. In these moments, you're not fully asleep, and yet you're not fully grounded in waking reality either. You're in between, and in that in-between space, the mind reveals something about itself. It shows that the boundary we often assume is so clear between dream and reality is not as solid as it seems. It is more like a gentle transition, a fading from one state into another, a blending. You might even begin to notice smaller versions of this blending in everyday life. The way a dream lingers for a few moments after you wake, its emotional tone still present, even as the details fade. Or how a strong memory can briefly feel as though it is happening again, not just remembered, but experienced. Or even how imagination, when vivid enough, can momentarily shape how something feels, as if it were real. These are all small reminders that your experience of reality is not fixed. It is fluid, shaped by the state your mind is in, by the balance between external input and internal creation. And sleep paralysis, though often described in dramatic ways, is simply one of the clearest examples of this. A moment where the mind continues to dream, even as awareness returns. A moment where reality and imagination gently overlap. And perhaps, when seen this way, it becomes less something to fear and more something to understand. A glimpse into how your mind works, not only at night but at all times, quietly constructing, quietly interpreting, quietly blending what is out there with what is within. As this idea settles, it invites a softer kind of curiosity, because if the mind can carry fragments of dreams into waking life, then perhaps the separation between these states is not as absolute as it feels. Perhaps dreaming and waking are not entirely different processes, but variations of the same underlying activity. And within that activity, there are moments, rare but fascinating, where awareness itself begins to shift. Moments where you are still inside a dream, but something changes, something becomes clear. You realize gently that what you are experiencing is not the external world, but something created by your own mind. And in that moment, a new kind of awareness begins to emerge. As that soft boundary between dreaming and waking begins to blur, there is a particular moment, rare but quietly extraordinary, where something shifts in a way that feels almost impossible at first. You're still inside the dream. The world around you is still unfolding just as before. The scenery, the sounds, the sensations, all remain intact. You can walk, speak, observe. The dream continues to feel immersive, complete. But something changes. You realize that you are dreaming. It is not always a dramatic realization. Sometimes it arrives gently, like a quiet thought drifting into awareness. A small detail doesn't quite make sense. A pattern repeats. Something feels slightly off. And instead of passing by unnoticed, as it usually would, you pause. And in that pause, recognition appears. This is not the external world. This is something your mind is creating. And yet, even with that understanding, the dream does not vanish. It remains. You're still inside it. But now, you're aware of it. This is what is often called a lucid dream. But rather than focusing on the name, it may be more interesting to simply notice what is happening. Because in that moment, your awareness has taken on a new quality. You're no longer fully absorbed in the experience, as you would be in an ordinary dream. Nor are you fully separate from it, as you are in waking life. You are somewhere in between, present but observing, engaged but aware. It is as though the mind has gently stepped back, just enough to see itself. And this raises a quiet and fascinating question. If you can be aware of a dream while still inside it, then what exactly is that awareness? It is not the dream itself. The dream is the environment, the story, the shifting world around you. It is not the body either, because your physical body is resting, still and unmoving. And yet, something is there. Something that knows, something that notices, something that can say, quietly, "This is a dream." You might think of it as a kind of inner light, not a physical light, but a soft presence that illuminates experience from within. It does not create the images, but it sees them. It does not control every detail, but it is aware of them. And in a lucid dream, that awareness becomes more visible, more accessible, more clearly felt. There is also something else that sometimes happens in these moments, a sense of possibility. Because once you realize that the dream is being generated by your own mind, the boundaries of that world begin to loosen. Some people describe being able to change their surroundings, to move in ways that would not be possible in waking life, to fly, to explore, to reshape the environment. But even without control, there is a shift, a quiet freedom, because the world no longer feels fixed or external. It feels fluid, responsive, as though it is gently unfolding from within you. And yet, even here, emotion still plays a role. If the awareness is calm, the dream tends to remain stable. If excitement rises too quickly, the scene may begin to fade. If fear appears, the dream can shift in unexpected ways. It's a delicate balance, a conversation, once again, between feeling and experience. And through it all, awareness remains, watching, noticing, present. This leads us to something subtle, but deeply important. The mind does not require an external world to generate experience. In a dream, everything you see, hear and feel is created internally, and yet the experience is rich, detailed, meaningful. But more than that, awareness itself continues, even when the external world is absent, even when the body is still, even when the environment is entirely imagined. This suggests something quiet but profound. That consciousness, your capacity to experience, is not simply a reaction to the outside world. It is something that can exist, even in its absence. This does not mean that consciousness is separate from the brain, or that it exists independently in some mysterious way. But it does suggest that the relationship between the two is more subtle than it first appears, because what you experience is not just a direct reflection of what is out there. It is something that arises from within, shaped by the activity of the mind itself. And in a lucid dream, this becomes easier to see. You are aware, without needing input from your senses. You are present, without needing a physical environment. You are experiencing a siyam, even though the world you're in is not externally real. It is a gentle reminder that what you call reality is always filtered through this awareness, and that awareness remains, even as the contents of experience change. As this idea settles, it does not need to lead to conclusions, it does not need to be resolved, it can simply rest, like a quiet question that softens the edges of certainty. Because if awareness can exist within a dream, observing a world created by the mind, then perhaps what we call waking life is not as different as it seems. Perhaps it is another version of experience, shaped differently, guided more by external input, but still unfolding within the same field of awareness. And that brings us gently towards something even deeper, because while we can describe these experiences, while we can observe patterns, measure activity and trace connections within the brain, there is still something we do not fully understand, something that remains just out of reach. Not the images, not the sensations, but the simple, undeniable fact that they are felt at all, that there is something it is like to experience, and that quiet mystery is where our journey begins to open even further. As that image of awareness within a dream begins to settle, something else slowly comes into view, like a shape emerging through a soft morning mist. Because once you've noticed that you can be aware, even while the world around you is entirely created by your own mind, a new kind of question begins to form. What is awareness when there is nothing external to be aware of? It's a question that doesn't need a quick answer. It can simply be held gently, like something fragile and interesting. You might begin by noticing something very simple. Right now, as you listen, your awareness seems to be connected to the world around you. You may hear the faint hum of a fan or distant sounds from outside. You may feel the surface beneath you or the subtle rhythm of your breath. Your experience feels anchored to something outside of you. But in a dream, that anchor disappears. There is no external sound, and yet you hear. No external light, and yet you see. No physical movement, and yet you can walk, run, or simply exist within a space that feels complete. And still, you are aware. This suggests something very quiet, but very important. That awareness is not simply a response to the outside world. It is something that can continue, even when the outside world is no longer present in the usual way. You might think of it like a kind of inner space. Not a physical place, but a capacity. A space where experience can arise. Sometimes that experience is shaped by the world outside you, by light, sound, and sensation. And sometimes, as in a dream, it is shaped entirely from within. But the space itself remains. It is always there, quietly allowing experience to appear and disappear. There is a gentle metaphor that can help here. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, watching a film projected onto a screen. The images change, the story unfolds, characters come and go, but the screen itself remains unchanged. It does not depend on the film to exist, it simply allows the film to be seen. In a similar way, awareness is like that screen. The contents of experience, the sights, the sounds, the thoughts, the feelings, are like the film. They come and go, they change, they shift, but awareness remains present, quietly holding them all. And in a lucid dream, this becomes easier to notice. Because the film is no longer tied to the external world, it is clearly being generated by the mind itself, and yet the screen is still there, still allowing the experience to unfold. You might begin to sense that awareness is not something you do. It is not an effort or a task. It is something that is simply present, effortless, quiet, always in the background, even when you're not paying attention to it. There is also something interesting about how this awareness relates to identity. In waking life, your sense of self is often tied to your body, your memories, your thoughts. You feel like a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. But in dreams, that sense of identity can shift. You may still feel like yourself, but the details can change. Your surroundings, your role, even your perspective can be different. And yet, something remains consistent. The awareness that experiences it all. This is not a new or unfamiliar feeling. You might notice it in quiet moments, even while awake. Perhaps when you sit still for a moment and simply observe your thoughts. They come and go like clouds drifting across the sky. Some are clear, some are vague, some carry emotion, some pass quickly. But there is something that notices them, something that is not the thoughts themselves, but is aware of them. That same awareness is present in dreams. It is present when you wake. It is present now as you listen. And yet, it is not something we fully understand. We can describe what the brain is doing. We can observe patterns of activity, trace connections, measure signals. We can say that certain regions become more active while others grow quiet, that certain chemicals increase or decrease, that certain networks within the brain coordinate to produce different states of experience. But none of this fully explains one simple fact. That experience feels like something, that there is a quality to being aware, a presence, a sense of what it is like to exist, even for a moment. This is sometimes described, in more technical language, as the difference between describing a process and explaining the experience of that process. But rather than focusing on the terminology, it may be more helpful to simply notice the mystery itself. Because even as science continues to explore the brain, mapping its structure, understanding its functions, there remains this quiet gap between the activity and the experience, between the physical and the felt. And this gap is not something to be solved quickly. It is something to be gently observed, because it reminds us that there is still so much we do not know, and perhaps that is part of what makes the mind so interesting. Not just what it does, but what it is. As this thought settles, slowly, like leaves drifting onto still water, it invites us to look a little closer at something we often take for granted. The feeling of being a self, the sense that there is a you, a stable center behind all of these experiences, a continuous thread that runs from your past, through your present, and into your future. But as we begin to explore that idea more gently, we may find that even this sense of self is not as solid as it first appears. As that gentle sense of awareness begins to feel more familiar, something quiet remains, almost like a question that doesn't quite settle. You can notice thoughts as they come and go. You can observe sensations rising and fading. You can even recognize moments when your mind is dreaming, or imagining, or remembering. But beneath all of that, there is something more subtle, something that is not the thoughts, not the images, not the sensations, but the simple fact that they're being experienced at all. It may seem like a small detail at first, easy to overlook, but if you stay with it just for a moment, it begins to feel quite remarkable, because everything we've explored so far, the filtering of perception, the predictions of the brain, the creation of dreams, the shaping of experience, all of it describes how the mind works, but none of it fully explains why it feels like anything, why there is a sense of presence, why there is something it is like to be here. You might imagine for a moment a very advanced machine, a system capable of processing information, recognizing patterns, making decisions, even responding to its environment in complex ways. From the outside, it could appear intelligent, responsive, almost alive. But there is a quiet question that lingers beneath that image. Is there anything it feels like to be that machine? Is there an inner experience, or is it simply processing without awareness? Now, when you turn that question back toward yourself, something shifts. Because in your own experience, there is no doubt. There's something it feels like to be you. Not in a complicated or abstract sense, but in the simplest possible way. There is the feeling of listening, the sense of being present, the quiet awareness of existing right now. And this is where the mystery deepens, because while we can study the brain, observe its activity, and understand many of its functions, we do not yet fully understand how this inner experience arises from it. We can describe which parts of the brain are involved in vision, or memory, or emotion. We can observe how patterns of activity change when you're awake, asleep, or dreaming, but describing the process is not the same as explaining the experience. It's a bit like describing how a musical instrument works. You can explain how the strings vibrate, how the sound waves move through the air, how the ear receives them. But none of that fully captures what it feels like to hear the music. There is a difference between the mechanics and the experience, and that difference is where this mystery lives. It is sometimes referred to, in more formal language, as the hard problem of consciousness. Not because it is difficult in a mathematical sense, but because it asks something deeper. Why does physical activity give rise to experience at all? Why is there something it feels like instead of nothing? But rather than focusing on the terminology, you can simply notice the feeling of the question itself, because it doesn't demand an answer. It invites a kind of quiet curiosity, a willingness to sit with the unknown. And perhaps there is something calming about that. To recognize that even in a world where so much can be explained, measured, and understood, there are still aspects of existence that remain open, not as problems to be solved, but as mysteries to be explored gently. You might even notice how this mystery is present in the simplest moments. The warmth of a cup in your hands, the softness of a quiet room, the subtle rhythm of your breath. Each of these experiences has a quality, a feeling that cannot be reduced to numbers or descriptions. It is immediate, direct, personal, and yet it arises from processes that are in many ways impersonal and physical. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of the mind, that something as concrete as the brain, composed of cells, signals, and patterns, can give rise to something as intangible as experience. And while we can trace the pathways, observe the changes, and describe the systems involved, the bridge between the two remains for now incomplete. But this is not a failure, it is simply where we are, and perhaps it is part of what makes the exploration of the mind so endlessly fascinating. Because no matter how much we learn, there is always something just beyond reach, something that invites us to keep looking, but never demands that we arrive. As this idea begins to settle, softly, without needing resolution, it leads us towards something more personal. Because while the mystery of consciousness is vast and open, there is a more familiar question waiting quietly nearby. A question about identity, about the feeling that all of these experiences belong to someone, to you, the sense that there is a stable center, a continuous self that exists through time, the same you that was there yesterday, that is here now, and that will be there tomorrow. It feels obvious, natural, almost unquestionable, and yet, when we begin to look at it more closely, gently, without rushing, we may find that even this sense of self is not as fixed as it seems. As that quiet question about awareness begins to settle, something closer, more familiar, gently comes into focus. Not the world around you, not even the nature of consciousness itself, but something you carry with you at all times, the feeling of being you. It feels so natural that it rarely comes into question. There is a sense, steady and continuous, that you are the same person you were yesterday, the same person you have always been, moving through time, gathering experiences, changing perhaps, but still fundamentally the same. You might feel it now in a very simple way, a quiet sense of presence, a familiarity with your own thoughts, a recognition that this experience belongs to you. But if we slow down just a little and look more closely, something subtle begins to shift. Imagine for a moment that you are holding an old photograph. Perhaps it's a picture of yourself from many years ago, a younger version, a different stage of life. You look at the image and there is an immediate recognition. That's me. But if you pause and really take it in, something curious appears. The face may look different, the expression unfamiliar. The person in the image may carry none of the memories, concerns, or perspectives that you have now. In fact, if you were to meet that person without knowing the connection, you might not recognize them as yourself at all. And yet, you still feel that it is you, not logically but intuitively. There is a thread that connects the two, a sense of continuity. But what exactly is that thread made of? It's not the body, because the body has changed. Cells have been replaced, features have shifted, time has quietly reshaped every part of it. It's not your thoughts, because the way you think now is not the same as it once was. Your beliefs, your preferences, your understanding of the world, all of it has evolved. Even your memories are not as stable as they may seem. And yet, the feeling remains. The sense that there is a single, continuous you that stretches across time. It's a very gentle illusion, not false in a harsh or dramatic sense, but softly constructed. Because what you're experiencing is not a fixed identity, but a sense of continuity that your mind maintains. You might begin to notice this continuity in small ways, the way you tell your own story. If someone were to ask you about your life, you would likely describe it as a sequence. One event leading to another, a path unfolding over time. Even the difficult moments, the changes, the unexpected turns, they're all woven into a single narrative. It feels cohesive. It feels like it belongs to one person. But this coherence is not something that exists automatically. It is something your mind creates, a gentle stitching together of moments, forming a story that feels stable enough to stand on. Without that stitching, experience would still occur, but it might feel more fragmented, less connected, less personal. So the mind gathers pieces, memories, sensations, emotions, thoughts, and it arranges them in a way that creates a sense of continuity, a sense that there is someone at the center of it all, you. There is nothing wrong with this process. In fact, it is deeply useful. It allows you to navigate the world, to plan, to relate to others, to understand your place in time. But it also means that the self you experience is not something fixed and unchanging. It is something that is maintained, quietly, constantly. You might notice how easily this sense of self can shift depending on the situation. The way you feel when you're alone, compared to when you are with others. The way you think in a moment of calm, compared to a moment of stress. Even the version of yourself that exists in memory is not quite the same as the one you experience now. And yet, all of these versions feel connected. They are all included in the story. There is also something interesting about how quickly the mind adjusts this story when needed. If something unexpected happens, something that doesn't quite fit with how you see yourself, the mind often finds a way to integrate it, to explain it, to make it part of the narrative. In this way, the sense of self is not just continuous, it is flexible, adaptive, always adjusting to maintain coherence. And because this process is so smooth, so quiet, it feels as though there has always been a stable identity at the center. But if you look gently, without trying to force a conclusion, you may begin to sense that what feels like a solid core is actually something more fluid, more like a pattern than a fixed object, a pattern that persists, not because it never changes, but because it changes in a way that feels connected, like a melody. Each note is different, each moment passes, but the pattern continues, giving the sense of something whole. And perhaps that is what the self is, not a fixed thing, but a continuous unfolding, a story that your mind keeps gently telling, moment by moment, so that everything feels like it belongs together. As this idea settles softly, it does not need to disrupt anything. You're still here, still present, still experiencing the quiet rhythm of this moment. But perhaps there is just a little more space around that sense of you, a little more openness, because if the self is something that is maintained, rather than something that is permanently fixed, then it invites a deeper question, not about who you were or who you will be, but about how this story is created in the first place, how the mind gathers pieces of the past and shapes them into something that feels real, even when those pieces are not as stable as they seem. As that soft sense of continuity begins to loosen, as the idea of a stable self becomes just a little more flexible, there is something even, closer to look at, something that feels reliable, but may not be as solid as it seems. Memory. It is easy to think of memory as a kind of storage, a place where moments are kept, waiting to be retrieved, like a collection of photographs or recordings neatly arranged somewhere in the mind. When you remember something, it feels as though you are simply accessing what was already there, replaying it. But if you sit with that feeling for a moment, something begins to shift, because memory does not behave like a recording. It behaves more like a reconstruction. Imagine for a moment that you're recalling a simple event, perhaps a conversation you had recently. You can hear parts of it in your mind, the tone of voice, the general flow of what was said. It feels familiar, clear enough. But if you were to compare that memory with an actual recording of the conversation, you might notice small differences. A word slightly changed, a sentence remembered differently, a detail added or quietly left out. These differences are not mistakes in the usual sense. They are part of how memory works. Because when you remember something, you're not pulling a complete and exact copy from storage. You're rebuilding the experience, using pieces, fragments of what happened, fragments of how it felt, and fragments of what you expect to have happened. Your mind takes these pieces and assembles them into something that feels whole, something that makes sense. And because this process is smooth, almost effortless, it feels like recall, but it is in fact creation. You might begin to notice this more clearly when you think about older memories, events from years ago, moments from childhood. These memories often feel vivid in certain ways and vague in others. You may remember the general setting, the emotion, the sense of what it meant to you at the time, but the details can shift. If you recall the same memory on different days, you might notice that it is not exactly the same each time. A small detail changes, the emphasis moves, the feeling becomes slightly different, and each time, your mind quietly updates the memory, not deliberately, not consciously, but gently as part of the process. This means that memory is not something fixed in the past. It is something alive in the present. Each time you remember, you're not just accessing the past, you are reshaping it. There is also something interesting that happens when two people remember the same event. They may agree on the general outline, what happened, where it took place, who was involved, but the details can differ. One person may recall a moment as joyful, while another remembers it as uncomfortable. One may focus on a specific detail, while the other doesn't remember it at all, and yet both feel certain. Both feel that their memory is accurate. This is not because one is right and the other is wrong. It is because memory is shaped not only by what happened, but by how it was experienced, by emotion, by perspective, by the meaning that was attached to the moment. And these elements are not the same for everyone. Even within yourself, they are not always the same. A memory that once felt painful may soften over time. A moment that seemed insignificant may become meaningful later. The event itself does not change, but your relationship to it does. And because memory is reconstructed each time, it changes along with you. This has a quiet but powerful implication. If your memories are not exact records, but evolving reconstructions, then the story you tell about your past is not fixed. It is something your mind is continually updating, gently adjusting to fit your current understanding, your current perspective, your current sense of self. And because your sense of self is built, in part, from these memories, it too is shaped by this process. You're not simply remembering who you were. You are, in a subtle way, recreating who you have been each time you think about it. This does not make your memories false. It makes them human. It makes them part of a living process, one that connects your past to your present in a way that feels meaningful, even if it is not perfectly precise. There is a softness in this realization, because it suggests that the past is not something rigid and unchangeable. It is something that lives within you, shaped by how you understand it now. And perhaps that is why memory feels the way it does, not like a cold archive of facts, but like a story that is told and retold, each time with small variations, each time shaped by the perspective of the present moment. And just like any story, it has a structure, a sense of flow, a way of connecting events into something that feels coherent. Which brings us gently to the next step in this unfolding idea. Because if memory is not a perfect record, but a reconstruction, and if the sense of self is built from these memories, then perhaps the self is not something that exists independently at all. Perhaps it is something that emerges from the story your mind keeps telling, a story that connects the past to the present and quietly reaches toward the future. As that gentle understanding of memory begins to settle, that what you remember is not a fixed recording, but something softly reconstructed each time, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. Because if your memories are not perfectly stored, but continuously reshaped, then the sense of who you are, built from those memories, may also be something more fluid than it first appears. You might begin to notice this in a very simple way. If someone asks you to describe yourself, you will likely tell a story, not all at once and not in perfect detail, but in a way that connects moments together. You might speak about where you've been, what you've experienced, what you value, what you hope for. You might describe certain events as important, others as less so. You might highlight certain qualities, certain patterns that feel like you. And as you speak, something interesting happens. You're not just recalling information, you're organizing it, shaping it, arranging it into something that makes sense, a narrative. This narrative gives your life a sense of continuity. It connects the past to the present, and it gently extends toward the future. It allows you to feel like there is a coherent thread running through everything you've experienced. But if you pause for a moment and look a little closer, something subtle begins to appear. That story is not fixed. It changes, not dramatically perhaps, but quietly, over time. The way you describe a past event may shift as your perspective changes. A moment that once felt confusing may later feel meaningful. Something that once seemed important may gradually fade into the background. Even the way you describe yourself can change. At one point you might see yourself as cautious, at another as curious, at another as resilient. Each of these descriptions may feel true, and yet none of them fully defines you. They're all parts of a larger story, one that is still being written, and perhaps that is the key. The self is not a finished thing. It is an ongoing process, a story that your mind is constantly updating as new experiences unfold and as old ones are reinterpreted. This doesn't happen in a deliberate way. You're not consciously editing your identity at every moment. It happens quietly, in the background. Each time you remember something, the memory may shift slightly. Each time you reflect on an experience, its meaning may evolve. Each time you imagine the future, you begin to shape who you feel you are becoming, and all of these elements come together, forming a narrative that feels stable enough to trust. But if you look gently, without trying to hold on to it too tightly, you may begin to sense that this stability is not absolute. It is something maintained, a kind of balance. You might think of it like a story that is told over many chapters. Each chapter adds something new. Some details are emphasized, others are left behind. Characters evolve, the tone shifts, but as long as the chapters connect, as long as there is a sense of flow, it feels like one continuous story, even though it is always changing. In this way, the self is less like a fixed object, and more like a narrative thread. It doesn't exist in a single moment. It exists across moments, connecting them, giving them meaning. There is also something else worth noticing. The story you tell about yourself is not created in isolation. It is shaped by your interactions with others, by the culture around you, by the language you use to describe your experiences. Even the way you think about identity, what it means to be a person, is influenced by the world you are part of. So the self is not just something internal. It is something that emerges at the intersection of your inner experience and the environment around you, a kind of shared construction. And yet, despite all of this complexity, it still feels personal. It still feels like you. This is part of what makes the idea so subtle, because the narrative is so closely tied to your experience that it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like reality. But when you begin to see how it is formed, how it shifts, how it adapts, how it is continuously updated, something softens, not in a way that takes anything away, but in a way that creates space. Because if the self is a story, then it is not something that has to be rigid. It is not something that must remain exactly as it is. It is something that can evolve, something that can change, something that is, in a quiet way, alive. There is a gentle sense of freedom in that. Not a dramatic freedom, but a subtle one. The kind that comes from realizing that identity is not something you are trapped inside, but something that is always unfolding. And perhaps this is why the sense of self can feel both stable and flexible at the same time. Stable enough to provide continuity, flexible enough to adapt. A balance between holding together and allowing change. As this idea begins to settle, like a story that continues even after the page is turned, it invites another question. If the self is a narrative, something constructed from memory, shaped by experience, continuously updated, then who or what is making the decisions within that story? Who is choosing what to do next? It feels as though there is someone in control, guiding actions, making choices, directing the flow of events, But if the self itself is something constructed, then perhaps the sense of control is also something worth looking at just a little more closely. As that quiet idea settles, that the self may be more like a story than a fixed centre, another question begins to form almost naturally. If the self is something that is continuously constructed, then what is it that makes decisions? When you choose something, what to say, what to do, where to go, it feels immediate, personal, as though there is a clear moment where you decide and then act. It feels like control. But if you slow this process down just a little, something subtle begins to appear. Think of a simple action, reaching for a glass of water. It feels as though you decide first, and then your hand begins to move. The intention seems to come before the action. But if you pay close attention to moments like this, especially the very small ones, you may notice something interesting. The movement often begins almost at the same time as the awareness of deciding. Sometimes it may even feel as though the action is already underway. Just before you fully notice the decision itself, it's a very delicate observation, easy to miss. But it suggests something gentle, yet important, that the process of deciding may not be as clearly separated from the action as it seems. Instead of a simple sequence, first the decision, then the action, it may be more like a single unfolding event, a process that begins beneath awareness and then rises into it. You might begin to notice this in everyday moments, when you suddenly think of something to say without having planned it in advance, when you react quickly to a sound before you have time to think, when a thought appears in your mind and you realize you didn't consciously choose to think it. These experiences are very common, so common in fact that they usually go unnoticed. But if you pause and observe them gently, they reveal something about how the mind works. That many processes begin before you're aware of them, not in a dramatic or unsettling way, but quietly, beneath the surface. And awareness, rather than initiating everything, may be more like a place where these processes become visible, where they are noticed after they have already begun. This does not mean that you have no influence over your actions. It simply suggests that the feeling of being in control may not come from initiating every step. It may come from observing and integrating what is already unfolding. You can think of it like watching a wave form in the ocean. From a distance, it may seem as though the wave appears suddenly rising from the surface, but in reality, it is the result of many small movements, currents, pressures, interactions that build over time. By the time the wave is visible, it is already in motion. In a similar way, a decision may begin as a quiet build-up. Subtle processes within the mind, memories, preferences, emotions, interacting and shaping a direction. And when that direction becomes clear enough, it enters awareness. It feels like a decision. But it is, in some sense, the visible part of a process that has already been unfolding. You might notice this especially in moments of spontaneity, when you laugh at something unexpected, when you respond quickly in conversation, when you reach out to help someone without thinking about it. These actions feel natural, immediate, effortless, because they are not being constructed step by step in conscious thought. They are arising from patterns that already exist within you, patterns shaped by your past experiences, your habits, your understanding of the world, and awareness simply meets them as they appear. There is also something interesting about how thoughts themselves arise. If you take a quiet moment and simply observe your thoughts, without trying to control them, you may notice that they come and go on their own. A memory appears, a plan forms, an idea drifts in. And if you look closely, you may realize that you didn't choose these thoughts in advance. They simply arrived. This does not mean that your mind is random or chaotic. It means that much of what happens within it is part of a deeper, ongoing process, one that does not always require conscious direction. And yet, when a thought appears, it feels like your thought. When an action happens, it feels like your action, because the sense of self, the narrative we explored earlier, gently integrates these events into a continuous story. It says, "This is me deciding. This is me acting." And that interpretation feels natural, seamless. But if you look just beneath that interpretation, something softer becomes visible. That decisions may not begin where they seem to begin. That control may not be as direct as it feels. And that awareness may be more like a witness than a commander. Not detached or distant, but present, observing, participating in a way that is more subtle than direct control. There's no need to push this idea too far. It is enough to notice the possibility, to allow the sense of control to soften just a little. Because when it does, something else often emerges, a sense of ease, less pressure to manage every detail, less need to hold everything together, and perhaps a quiet trust in the processes that are already unfolding. As this idea settles, gently, without resistance, it opens the way to another layer of understanding. Because even if decisions arise before awareness, there is still something guiding them, something shaping how you respond, how you feel, how you move through the world. And much of that guidance comes not from careful reasoning, but from something more immediate, more intuitive, more deeply connected to feeling. And that is where our attention begins to turn next. As that soft understanding settles, that many of your actions may begin before you are fully aware of them, another layer begins to unfold, one that feels both familiar and quietly surprising. Because if awareness is not always the starting point, then what is? What is guiding these choices, shaping these actions, giving direction to what unfolds before you even notice it? If you look closely, gently, without trying to force an answer, you may begin to notice something very simple. Much of what you do begins with a feeling, not a detailed plan, not a carefully constructed line of reasoning, but a subtle sense of inclination, a pull towards something, or away from it. You might notice this in small, everyday moments, the way you choose what to eat, often guided by what feels appealing in the moment, the way you respond to a message, influenced by how it makes you feel even before you think about what to say, the way you decide whether to trust someone based on a quiet impression that forms almost instantly. These decisions can feel natural, effortless, as though they simply arise, and in many ways, they do. There is a part of your mind that responds quickly, automatically, without needing to pause and analyze every detail. It recognizes patterns, draws on past experience, and forms impressions almost immediately. This part is not separate from you. It is you, in a different mode. A mode that is fast, intuitive, and deeply connected to emotion. And then there's another mode, a slower, more deliberate way of thinking. The part of your mind that reflects, considers, evaluates. The part that weighs options, compares possibilities, and tries to make sense of things in a more structured way. Both of these modes are always present in their own way, but they do not always contribute equally. In many situations, the faster, more emotional response comes first. It offers an initial direction, and the slower, more reflective thinking follows, sometimes supporting that direction, sometimes questioning it, sometimes adjusting it. You might notice this when you make a quick decision, and then, a moment later, begin to explain it to yourself. You create reasons, you form a narrative, but if you look carefully, those reasons often come after the feeling. It is as though the mind gently fills in the explanation to match what has already been chosen. This is not a flaw. It is part of how the mind creates coherence. Because once an action begins or a decision is made, the mind naturally seeks to understand it, to place it within the story of who you are. And so it explains, it justifies, it makes sense of what has already unfolded. There is something very human in this process, because it allows your experience to feel continuous, meaningful, connected. But it also means that logic is not always the starting point. Often it is part of the story that follows. You might notice this in moments of strong emotion. When you feel fear, your attention sharpens. You become more alert, more focused on potential threats. Your interpretation of the world shifts, even if the external situation has not changed. When you feel calm, the world appears softer, more open, more manageable. When you feel joy, things seem brighter, more connected, more meaningful. In each case, the emotion shapes how reality feels, and from that feeling, your responses emerge, your actions, your thoughts, your decisions, all influenced by the tone that emotion has set. This is not something that happens only in extreme situations. It is present in quiet, everyday moments as well. A subtle preference, a slight hesitation, a quiet sense of comfort or discomfort. These small emotional signals guide your attention, your choices, your behaviour, often without needing to be fully articulated. And because this process is so smooth, so immediate, it feels natural. It feels like you. But when you begin to notice it, gently, without judgment, something becomes clearer. That what you call decision-making is not a purely logical process. It is a conversation, a balance between feeling and reflection, between what arises quickly and what is considered more slowly. And in many cases, feeling speaks first. This does not mean that logic is unimportant. It plays a crucial role, especially in situations that require careful thought, planning, or analysis. But even then, it often works in partnership with emotion, guided by it, shaped by it. There is a softness in this realization, because it allows you to see your own decisions, not as rigid outcomes of perfect reasoning, but as part of a living process, one that is influenced by your history, your experiences, your internal state, all interacting in ways that are not always visible. And perhaps, as you begin to see this more clearly, there is a sense of understanding that comes with it, a kind of patience. Because if your decisions are shaped by processes that unfold before awareness, and guided by feelings that arise naturally, then there is less need to hold everything tightly, less pressure to be perfectly in control, and more space to simply notice how your experience is forming, moment by moment. As this idea settles, gently, it leads us towards something even more subtle, because beyond decisions, beyond thoughts, beyond emotions, there is an entire system within you that is constantly active, a system that keeps your body alive, balanced, and functioning, without ever asking for your attention. A quiet, continuous activity, happening beneath everything you are aware of, and it too plays a part in what you experience as you. As that gentle, understanding settle that many of your decisions are shaped by processes that begin before you're aware of them, there is something even more fundamental to notice, something that has been with you from the very beginning, quietly supporting every moment of your life, your body. It may seem obvious at first. You feel it constantly in subtle ways, the rise and fall of your breath, the weight of your hands resting somewhere nearby, the quiet presence of your heartbeat, even if you rarely pay attention to it. It all feels like part of you, and in a very real sense it is. But if you look just a little more closely, something surprising begins to appear. Most of what your body does happens without you. You do not consciously decide for your heart to beat. You do not instruct your lungs to breathe in and out, moment after moment, even as you sleep. You do not guide the countless processes that keep your body balanced, adjusting temperature, distributing energy, repairing cells, responding to changes in your environment. All of this is happening continuously, quietly, effortlessly, without asking for your attention. You might pause for a moment and simply notice your breathing, not trying to change it, just observing. The air moves in and out. It continues, whether you think about it or not. If you shift your attention away, it does not stop. It carries on. There is a quiet intelligence in this, a system that is always active, always adjusting, always responding, and yet it does not feel like something you're actively controlling. It simply happens. You might begin to sense that what you call you, the part that feels like it is thinking, deciding, observing, is only a small part of a much larger process. A process that includes not just thoughts and decisions, but also the continuous activity of the body itself. Consider for a moment what is happening inside you right now. Your heart is gently contracting and relaxing, sending blood through a vast network of vessels, delivering oxygen and nutrients to every part of your body. Your cells are exchanging materials, repairing tiny structures, maintaining balance in ways too detailed to track consciously. Your body temperature is being regulated, adjusting ever so slightly to maintain a stable internal environment. Hormones are being released in careful amounts, influencing your mood, your energy, your sense of alertness or calm. All of this is unfolding without any conscious instruction. It does not pause to ask for permission. It does not wait for a decision. It simply continues. And yet, it is all part of what allows you to experience anything at all. Without it, there would be no thoughts, no perceptions, no sense of self. So where in all of this is the you that feels like it is in control? It's not a question meant to remove anything, but to gently expand the perspective. Because when you begin to see how much is happening automatically, how much is unfolding without conscious direction, the sense of control can soften, not disappear, but soften. You might notice this even in simple actions. When you walk, you do not consciously plan each movement of your legs. The coordination happens naturally. When you speak, you do not select each word letter by letter. The sentences form, often flowing more quickly than you can fully track. When you react to something, a sudden sound, a shift in the environment, your body responds before you have time to think. These actions feel like yours, and in a sense they are, but they are not being constructed step by conscious thought. They arise from deeper patterns, from systems that have been shaped over time through experience, learning, and adaptation. There is a kind of quiet harmony in this, a collaboration between what you are aware of and what happens beyond awareness. And perhaps as you begin to notice this, there is a sense of ease that comes with it. Because if so much of your existence is supported by processes that do not require your constant attention, then there is less pressure to hold everything together, less need to manage every detail. You're not carrying the entire system on your own. You are part of it, a small but meaningful expression of something much larger. There is also something deeply grounding in this realization, because it connects you to something more fundamental than thought or identity. to the simple fact of being alive, breathing, existing, supported by countless processes that continue moment by moment, whether you're aware of them or not. And in that sense, the idea of control becomes less rigid, less absolute. Not something you either have or don't have, but something that exists within a much larger system of activity. A system that includes conscious awareness, but is not limited to it. As this idea settles, softly, without needing to resolve anything, it opens the door to a different kind of perspective. Because if the body operates without asking you, if decisions arise before you are aware of them, if the sense of self is something constructed, then the boundary between you and everything else may not be as clear as it seems. Perhaps what you call you is not a separate entity, but part of a continuous process. A process that extends beyond your thoughts, beyond your body, into something larger. And as that possibility begins to take shape, gently, without urgency, it leads us toward a quieter, more expansive way of seeing. As that quiet sense settles, that much of what you are is already unfolding without effort, that thoughts arise, decisions emerge, and the body continues on its own. Something begins to soften, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently. The feeling of being a separate, fixed center begins to loosen, just a little. You may have experienced moments like this before, even if only briefly. Perhaps while watching the sky at night, when your attention drifts outward, and for a moment the usual sense of you in the foreground becomes quieter. Or while listening to music, when you're so absorbed in the sound that the boundary between yourself and the experience begins to blur. Or even in stillness, when you sit quietly and thoughts slow down, and there is simply awareness, without a strong sense of identity attached to it. In these moments, nothing is lost. You're still present, still aware, but the feeling of being a clearly defined self becomes softer, less rigid, more open. This is not something unusual or distant. It is a natural shift, one that can happen when the mind is no longer tightly focused on maintaining its usual patterns. Because much of the sense of self is built from activity, from thoughts describing who you are, from memories reinforcing that identity, from expectations shaping how you see yourself. When these processes are active, the self feels solid, defined, but when they quiet down, even slightly, the sense of self can begin to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into something more spacious. You might begin to notice that experience continues, even without a strong sense of me attached to it. Sounds are still heard, sensations are still felt, the world is still present, but there is less separation between the observer and what is being observed. It is as though the usual boundary has become more transparent, not gone, just softer, more flexible. This can feel unfamiliar at first, but it is not something to be resisted. In fact, it often carries a sense of ease, a lightness, because the effort of maintaining a fixed identity, of constantly reinforcing the idea of who I am, begins to relax. And in that relaxation, there is more space for experience to simply be. There are also situations where this softening becomes more noticeable. Moments when the sense of self fades more deeply, sometimes described as a kind of dissolution. This can happen in states of deep meditation or in certain altered states of consciousness. But even without those extremes, the gentle version of it is always available. In the quiet pauses, in the spaces between thoughts, in the moments when attention is not tightly focused on the story of you. And what becomes clear in these moments is something very simple. That the sense of self is not required for experience to exist. It is one way of organizing experience, but not the only way. Experience itself continues, awareness remains, but the structure that says this is happening to me becomes less prominent. This does not mean that identity disappears completely. It returns naturally as thoughts resume, as the mind re-engages with its patterns. But having seen that it can soften, that it is not fixed, something changes. There's less need to hold on to it so tightly, less need to define it so precisely, because you have glimpsed something quieter beneath it, a kind of presence that does not depend on labels or definitions, just awareness, existing on its own. There is also something deeply calming in this, because much of what creates tension in the mind comes from maintaining a sense of separation, the idea that I am here and everything else is out there, that I must manage, control, understand, navigate. But when that boundary softens, even slightly, the sense of effort can ease. The world is no longer something entirely separate from you. It becomes something you are participating in, more directly, more fluidly. And this is not a philosophical statement. It is an experiential one, something you can notice, gently, in your own way. There is no need to force it, no need to try to dissolve the self. It happens naturally, in small ways, whenever the mind becomes quiet enough. And perhaps that is enough, to simply recognize that the sense of self is not as solid as it feels, that it can shift, soften, expand, and that beneath it there is something more open, more spacious, more at ease. As this understanding settles, slowly, like a calm spreading across still water, it leads to something even broader. Because if the boundary between self and experience can soften, then perhaps the boundary between you and the world itself is not as fixed as it seems. Perhaps what feels separate is part of something continuous, something connected, and as that idea begins to take shape, gently, without urgency, it opens into a wider perspective, one that does not remove you from the world, but places you more deeply within it. As that quiet sense of space begins to open, as the feeling of a fixed boundary softens just a little, something wider begins to come into view. Not something distant, but something that has always been there, quietly present, just beyond the edges of how we usually think about ourselves. The sense that you are part of something larger. This idea is often expressed in very big, abstract ways. It can sound distant, almost philosophical, but it does not need to be approached that way. It can begin with something very simple, your breath. The air you are breathing right now was not created by you. It has moved through the world long before this moment. It has been part of forests, oceans, and skies. It has passed through countless living things, each one taking it in, releasing it again, and now, for a brief moment, it is part of you. Then it leaves and continues on. There is no clear line where the world ends, and you begin. Just a continuous exchange. You might notice something similar with food. The energy that allows your body to move, to think, to feel, comes from what you have taken in from the world around you. Plants, sunlight, water, all transformed step by step into something that becomes part of your body. And over time, that body changes. Cells are replaced. Structures are renewed. What feels like a stable form is, in reality, always in motion, always exchanging, always connected. Even the warmth you feel, the subtle temperature of your body is part of a balance with the environment around you. Heat moves slowly between you and the space you're in. Again, there is no sharp boundary, only a gentle flow. And if you look beyond the body, this connection becomes even more expansive. Every element that makes up your body, every particle, every tiny building block, has a history that extends far beyond your lifetime. Long before you were born, these elements existed in other forms, in the earth, in the air, in distant places, shaped by processes that unfolded over vast stretches of time. They came together, gradually, forming the structure you now call your body, and one day, they will return to the wider world again, not disappearing, but transforming, continuing the same quiet cycle. This is not something abstract. It is something that is happening right now. You are not separate from the world. You are an expression of it. A temporary arrangement of processes, forming something that feels like a distinct you, but is in essence part of a continuous whole. There is also something interesting about how the mind reflects this connection. Earlier, we explored how perception is shaped by the brain, how experience is constructed from both external input and internal activity. In a similar way, the sense of separation between self and world is also part of that construction. It is useful. It allows you to navigate, to interact, to make sense of your surroundings. But it is not absolute. It is a boundary that can soften, shift, become more transparent, and when it does, the experience changes. The world feels less like something outside of you, and more like something you are participating in, not observing from a distance, but existing within. This does not remove your individuality. You still have your thoughts, your experiences, your perspective, but it places them within a larger context, a wider field. There is a quiet calm in that, because the sense of isolation, the feeling of being separate and alone, begins to ease, not because anything has been added, but because something has been seen more clearly, that the separation was never as complete as it seemed. You might notice this feeling in certain moments, when you stand near the ocean and the sound of the waves seems to fill your awareness, when you look at the sky and the sense of space feels almost infinite, when you sit in stillness and the distinction between inner and outer experience becomes less defined. In these moments, there is often a sense of connection, not forced, not explained, just quietly present, and perhaps that is enough. There is no need to turn this into a belief or a conclusion. It can simply be experienced in small ways whenever it naturally arises, because at its core, it is not about replacing one idea with another. It is about softening the edges of how things appear, allowing the sense of separation to relax just a little and noticing what remains, a continuous flow, a shared existence, a quiet unity that has always been there. As this idea settles, gently, like a horizon fading into the distance, it brings us toward the final part of this journey, not to resolve everything, but to gather what we have seen, to return softly to the question of reality, the mind and the self, and to find a way of holding these ideas that feels calm, open, and at ease. And so, as all of these ideas begin to settle, not as answers, but as quiet impressions, we find ourselves returning gently to where we began, to this moment, to the simple feeling of being here. You may notice the same quiet details from before, the softness of the air around you, the distant sounds that rise and fall, the steady rhythm of your breath moving without effort. Nothing has changed, and yet, something may feel just a little different, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in how you see. Because along the way, we've explored something quite simple, and yet deeply unfamiliar, that the world you experience is not something you receive directly. It is something your mind gently creates. not in a way that replaces reality, but in a way that shapes how reality is felt, understood, and lived. You have seen how your senses do not capture everything, but offer just enough for the mind to build a coherent picture, how your brain quietly predicts what comes next, filling in the gaps before you even notice them, how dreams reveal the mind's ability to create entire worlds, complete and convincing, without any external input at all, and how even in waking life, emotion, memory, and expectation continue to shape what feels real. None of this makes your experience false. It makes it human. It shows that what you call reality is not something rigid and fixed, but something living, something unfolding, something continuously shaped by the mind that experiences it. And when we turned inward, toward the sense of self, something equally subtle appeared, the feeling of being you, so familiar, so constant, and yet built from pieces that are always changing, memories that are reconstructed, not replayed, a narrative that is updated, not stored, a continuity that feels solid, even as everything within it shifts. And still, the experience remains. You're here, aware, present, not as a fixed object, but as a process, a quiet unfolding. And then, even the sense of control, that feeling of being the one who decides, began to soften, not disappear, but become more open. Actions arising before awareness, thoughts appearing without being chosen, the body continuing its work without asking for direction, all of it part of a larger system, one that you're within, not separate from. And finally, that boundary itself between you and the world began to feel less defined, not gone, just softer. Because the breath you take comes from the world. The body you feel is shaped by it. The awareness you experience moves within it. There is no sharp line, only a continuous flow. And perhaps, as all of this settles, there is a way of holding it that does not create tension. A way of seeing that does not require certainty, because none of these ideas are meant to take something away from you. They are not meant to unsettle or to replace what feels real. They're simply invitations, gentle reminders that what you experience is shaped, not fixed. That identity is flexible, not fragile. That uncertainty is not something to fear, but something that allows space for experience to move, to change, to unfold. You do not need to hold on to any of this tightly. You do not need to resolve it. It is enough to let it be, like a quiet background understanding, something that softens the edges of how things appear. And perhaps, in that softness, there is a kind of ease, a sense that you do not need to control everything, that the mind will continue to do what it does, gently creating, interpreting, shaping your experience moment by moment. And you can simply be here, present within it, not separate from it, not defined by it, but part of it, as naturally as breathing, as quietly as listening. And as this moment begins to fade into stillness, as your thoughts drift, perhaps a little more slowly now, there's nothing left to figure out, nothing left to hold on to, only the quiet rhythm of awareness and the soft unfolding of whatever comes next. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this gentle journey. If you'd like to return again for more quiet wanderings, you're always welcome here. For now, let everything rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.